Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in the Cops and Advantage series hosted by Game Plan Coaches Edition. My name is Kara Button and I am the Game Plan Advisor here at CSI Calgary. You're all muted, so please keep your microphones off during this session. If you have any questions for the presenters, you can put them in the chat box. We cannot operate the Q&A as normal because we're using interpretation, so that feature isn't an option. There will be some polls during this session. They're hard, you can't use the polls on your phone, so if you would like to participate, it's better if you're on a computer or a tablet. Pour ceux d'entre vous qui souhaitent écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer sur Interprétation en bas de page et choisir le français. C'est la première fois que notre équipe explore la traduction en direct, alors n'hésitez pas à revenir en anglais si vous avez des difficultés à suivre la discussion. Nos facilitateurs feront leur mieux pour maintenir un ralentissement d'interprétation, mais veuillez comprendre qu'il y aura un certain retard. So there is my French for the day. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Susan Cockle and Jason Sostrom to discuss managing anxiety. Susan is a registered psychologist with over 2 decades of experience in counseling psychology. She specializes in mental skills for optimal performance, which caused her to create C4 Success, which is an online mental skills training platform. Susan was a volleyball player, field hockey player, a sprinter, and she continues to run often. Jason Sostrom delivers high performance coach education, including advanced coaching diploma at the CSI Calgary. He's a former CIS gymnast, and his current hobby is playing bagpipes for the Calgary Police Service Bagpipe Band. Okay, over to you, Jason.
Awesome, thanks so much, Kara. Well, I'm really excited about the session. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Susan and I have had some very fantastic conversations talking about this topic and bringing it forward. So I'm really excited to let this play out. I can't wait. So Susan, I'll throw it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just realizing I need to update my bio. I love that it said Susan runs often. Susan used to run often before the old hip injury kicked in, and not so much anymore, but thanks for the warm introduction. One of the things we want to do today is just encourage everyone to get started by just plugging in to our time and place of being together right now. And if we can, just put aside maybe what we have been working on before, what we've been thinking about, or even the stuccoing of the house, and just bring ourselves in time and place to this very moment. So I invite you just to check into your body and just notice yourself in the chair or wherever you might be, and just notice yourself being supported. You might feel your hamstrings in the chair or your sits bones being supported, and then your spine at the back of the chair. And if you're able, you may even find your feet planted on the ground, and just notice that. And as you bring yourself into your body, I'd like you now to notice your surroundings. Like, just notice 3 things in your environment. So for me, I'm noticing Canada flag, I'm noticing my cup of water, and I'm noticing my phone. All right. So one of the things we would like to do is create a safe space for everyone and welcome you. And we would love to know where you are located. So here we have poll number 1. Yes, this is going to be fun. So let's just see where everyone is coming from. There's a whole bunch of participants online right now. And I have to be mindful of speaking with an appropriate cadence because we're being simultaneously translated into French. And we are hoping for some really high participation because we're high achievers here. So we've got 80%, up to 83% of folks have voted. So keep leaning in, literally and figuratively. Lean in to vote. And I was hoping for 90%. Let's see if we can do it. Oh yeah, we're getting up there. Look at that, Jason. Yeah, here we go, 86%. Can we do it? Let's see if we can get over 90. Oh, it could be close, could be close. Okay, so, oh, Almost. We got 88%. Let's see if anyone else can help us over. All right, I think it's going to top out at 88%. So poll is closed, and let's see, can we share the results? Let's see where everyone is from. So we have, ooh, nice distribution. Look at this. So welcome to 24% of folks in Ontario, 23% in Quebec, 13% in British Columbia, 21 in Alberta, 1% in Manitoba, yay, 13% Saskatchewan, 3% in Nova Scotia, and 2% in New Brunswick. Brilliant. Welcome to everyone. So this is what we're going to do today. We're going to take a deeper dive into anxiety and managing anxiety. I'd also like to welcome my anxiety to the show today because, of course, it's going to kick in. I always think there's some irony attached to that when I'm chatting about managing anxiety and my own shows up. So bring it on. It's like, here it is. We can still do the job even though we have anxiety. So we're going to look at the who, what, why, when, where of anxiety. How does it show up in the mind, the body, and the brain? We're going to talk about how do we actually stay emotionally regulated. Now, that's not calm. It's emotionally regulated. The big 5 types of anxiety, the do's and don'ts. And we're going to look at deliberate practice. And Jason and I are going to chat more about that as we go. I'm going to present a bunch of slides and some information, and then Jason and I are going to do some chit chat. And we invite you to ask us questions so that we can make it interactive. And then we're going to do a technique at the end as well. All right, I'm just going to get rid of the poll. All right, so here we are. So what is anxiety? Well, anxiety is a normal human response. It's a human response to threat, to stress, and to pressure. And we really want to have a neutral attitude toward our anxiety. It's neither good nor bad. It just is. It's actually defined as an uneasy state of mind, usually over the possibility of an anticipated misfortune or trouble. In other words, we get worried that we might screw up or something bad is going to happen. The other definition is an emotional experience in the presence of threat or danger. So when we think about sport, what do we have? We have pressure, we have stress, we have threat. We even use language that suggests that it is do or die or kill or be killed in the heat of competition. We say like it's going into battle. So no wonder we feel anxiety under those conditions. Anxiety is more than a feeling. It actually is a psychobiological state. So psyche, meaning psychology, and or the mind, and then biology, of course, the body. So it's a mind-body state. And it really is more of an interaction between the brain, the body, and the mind. So we're going to take a look at all of those components as we move on. So what is the purpose of our anxiety? It's to be able to keep us safe. Our anxiety keeps us safe from danger. So it's actually very helpful. Why do we have it? Well, it helps us make quick acting decisions. It saves us from danger. It makes us faster, more focused, able to escape and survive the threat. So if we think about it that way, it's actually very helpful for us. It's one of our most primitive self-protective mechanisms. It's survival of the species at the finest. And this is where I get a bit excited, because if we can use our primitive survival mechanism to actually aid in our performance, then we have an advantage. So when does it show up? It shows up on cue sometimes when we know there's a big important task at hand, like a major championship, but at other times it can be more random. And it can pop into our head and our mind and our body when we least expect it. So if we can better understand it, if we can have better awareness around it, then we're much better able to manage it. Where exactly does it show up? It shows up in the mind, the brain, and the body. So we're going to take a look at those. So here we have anxiety in the mind. This is our cognitive anxiety, or our thoughts. So often our thoughts are racing. They're fast, they're run on, and sometimes they just start ramping up on one another. So they start to layer, and we get a bit of a volcano effect before it kind of erupts. The fuel that will make our anxiety erupt is our what-ifing. When we hear ourselves what ifing, what if this happens, what if that happens, we know that that's our anxiety talking. So we want to be able to pay attention to that. When our anxiety starts talking inside our mind, it creates doubts and second guessing. It makes us compare ourselves to others, which actually is the cause of low self-esteem. So not that helpful to be comparing ourselves to others. And we tend to do that. We compare ourselves to our athletes, to other athletes, or we compare ourselves to other coaches. Not that helpful. Because when we do comparisons, we tend to compare ourselves unfavorably. The comparison is not to our best advantage, and we tend to be on the losing end of that. So all of that encompasses our negative self-talk, and we've all heard about negative self-talk. It's pretty normal, it's pretty typical, but it's just not that helpful. Now, you might think I'm now going to say, okay, so all we have to do is combat that with positive self-talk. But let's face it, sometimes our positive self-talk isn't that helpful either. And I know when I work with athletes and I say that, they're surprised that I say that the sports psych comes in and says that positive self-talk is not that helpful sometimes. Well, think about it. What happens if you pump yourself up? You're pumping yourself up, you are feeling good to go, you're ready to go, and you've pumped yourself up so much that you make a mistake or things go sideways, and then pretty quickly what happens is you move to, see, I told you, you suck. And then poof, things blow up. So we actually want to have helpful self-talk, which may or may not be necessarily positive depending on the person. So here's my first action item for you. I would like you to start listening more to your own thoughts. Just notice them and be curious about them. And start to stay a bit neutral toward them. It's our reaction to our thoughts that get us in trouble. So if we have an anxious thought, we just notice it as such. We label it as such. But we don't layer it with frustration or upset or put downs, because that, of course, makes it worse. So let's not get frustrated or mean or judgy when we have anxious thoughts. Again, they just are what they are. All right, so let's take a look at anxiety in the body. Now, I love this picture. This picture was drawn in my office by a 10-year-old gymnast, and she is quite pleased and proud for me to share it with you. And you can see she identified how does she feel at competition. And this is why she came to see me, because this is how she feels at competition. Red face, hot body. Oh my gosh, look how she's identified that with the red felt. My breathing stops. That's not a good thing when your breathing stops. I have shaky legs and shaky hands. My stomach is hurting. My heart is pounding. I feel like throwing up and I have tears. Oh my gosh, why do we play sport if this is what it does? Well, she loves her sport. She loves being a gymnast. She doesn't love this reaction, but she wants to play and she wants to compete and she wants to continue. So my job is to help her manage that. And one of the best ways to do that is to give her information around that, is to be able to say, your body's just getting ready for action. Now, I don't tell her, you're not anxious, you're just excited, because look how she's feeling in her body. Is she going to buy into that? No, that doesn't feel like excitement. Excitement is woohoo, Christmas is coming. It's the anticipation of something awesome, something positive. Anxiety is the anticipation of something going wrong. So I'm not going to blow smoke up her butt and say, oh, that was inappropriate. But anyway, I'm not going to let her say, I'm going to not let her think that this is her excitement talking. I'm going to let her think that, that's her anxiety talking, and that's okay. You'll actually just notice what I did there. I had a random thought pop into my head of, oh, that thought was inappropriate. And then I hear myself going, oh, whatever. And then I moved on, noticing my thoughts as I go. So what do I tell her? I tell her that, you've got a little bit of adrenaline going on, and that's the chemical in your body that's just getting you focused and it's getting you ready. There might be a little bit of cortisol, which is your stress hormone. Now, I may or may not go into a lot of detail with a 10-year-old, depending. The other thing I'll say to her is, the reason why your heart is pounding is because your body is trying to get all of the blood to or some of the blood, to be able to be a little bit more localized in your core. It's getting you ready to act. That's why your legs feel a bit shaky and your arms can feel a bit shaky, because when the blood is moving more to your core, the extremities start to tingle. Same with your stomach. The butterflies in your stomach is because the top of the stomach and the bottom of the stomach are shutting down a little bit. Your body is saying, excuse me, it's time for me to get ready for action. I don't have time to digest a steak. I don't have time to be putting a lot of energy into digesting food. So I don't want you to feel hungry right now. I don't want you to eat anything big. That's why you feel sick. And that's why sometimes you actually do throw up or have diarrhea. And of course they're going, she's going to talk about diarrhea? Yes, I talk about diarrhea because that is what happens when our anxiety is in our body and we get pressure around performance. But it's a good thing, because if you don't have a lot of extra weight in your stomach or in your bowel or even in your bladder for that matter, you're faster, you're ready to go. Some of the other things that we see in our body too, it depends on the person. Now this is kind of acute anxiety that this gymnast drew, but sometimes we get more of a pervasive kind of anxiety in the body. So we might see fidgeting or hesitation or reckless movements, lack of speech or overly talkative, poor eye contact. We have muscle tension or avoidance. That's when folks are saying, like, don't put me in, coach. I don't want to go in, because the anxiety's pumping the brake and saying, don't do this. Quick to anger or frustration. And often young males that I work with get misdiagnosed or mislabeled as having anger management problems, when really you can scratch under the surface and see, oftentimes they have some difficulties with anxiety instead. Having trouble sleeping is part of this as well. Rage quitting, and I wanted to put that in there because it was a term I learned last week with my young athletes. I rage quitted, Susan. So upset that they're losing in their mind the video game or at their homework right now or at their training program because it feels like it's too much, and then they just walk away and quit. Helplessness, frustration, all of those things come into play. What I'm seeing right now in terms of this COVID-19 response is not so much these acute signs of anxiety, but I'm seeing more flatness or losing focus, losing motivation. I had someone say to me last week, you don't even know what boredom is, Susan, until you've done COVID-19. Folks are getting bored, so they're getting quite flat. They're tending to give up a little bit. This is the money slide. This is what I really want you to get out of today's presentation. This is how anxiety shows up in the brain. And we understand this in just very kind of basic form. It actually really helps us with our awareness. So let's check it out. The red part in the diagram is the prefrontal cortex or the neocortex. It is the thinking part of the brain. It's the newest part of the brain that has developed over time. And it's what sets us apart from other mammals. So it's the rational decision maker. It's where thinking and learning happens. It is the boss. Goal-directed learning comes out of here. This is all your technical and tactical strategies that you have been laying down over time in all of your practices. It's the time manager. It's the executive function. It's basically the boss. It's where attention and focus and planning and speech happens. It is your playbook. Now, under stress, this part of the brain can start to shut down. It kind of goes offline a little bit. And when it goes offline, you can imagine that folks and athletes get really quiet, or ourselves, we get really quiet. So the speech center starts to shut down a little bit. We get more confused. And it's really hard to make good decisions. We want this part of the brain to stay fully functioning online when we are in the heat of competition, because when it starts to go offline, we're a bit hooped. What happens with anxiety when the prefrontal cortex goes offline, then the limbic system starts to take over. That's the green part. That's the emotional center of the brain. Now, the emotional center of the brain, its job is to scan for danger. Thank you, that's super helpful. but I might just not need a whole ton of it right now because I still want to be engaged to my prefrontal cortex. So what else goes on in the limbic system? Well, it processes memories. So sometimes when we're in the middle of competition, and you can feel this yourself as a coach, and something happens that triggers you back to something else that had happened before that maybe went sideways. It's like, uh-oh, here we go again. An emotional memory is starting to pop up. And we can feel it in our body as well as in our brain. Feelings, smells, it's the reward center of the brain. When you think of the smell of your gym bag or your shoes or your gloves or whatever it is you may have, and then you think back to your sport, that's the emotional part of your brain kicking in. It's also responsible for things like passion and motivation. And we need all of that to be able to function effectively. So we do need our green part of our brain to be on board, but it's also the worry center. So we want to be mindful that it can't take over. And then if we get super worried and super stressed and danger, danger, danger is going off, then we go into brainstem. And that's the purple part. That's the very back of your brain that attaches to your spinal cord. What does brainstem do? Well, brainstem is the reptilian brain. It's the oldest structure. Think of it as all of the parts of the brain that's online when you're born. So any of you who have little babies at home, think about what they do. They poo, they pee, they eat, they sleep, they repeat, they cry, right? That's what brainstem does. Fight, flight, freeze. And I've got a quick story about freeze for you. One time I was at watching competition, Olympic qualifier, and this is a team that I was working with. High stakes game, player goes up for the ball, comes down, lands on another player, goes over, hits the floor as quickly as you can imagine, and lets out a blood-curdling cry. A noise, a scream, unlike I have ever heard before that or since that. And if any of you have heard one of your athletes or even one of your teammates make a sound like that, you know what I'm talking about. I immediately go, "Ah!" And the venue, where there's over 3,000 people, goes completely quiet. I look down and I look at my hand. And if you see the screen, it's like this. And I notice my hand because what I'm doing is I realize I'm going over to the person who's sitting next to me and I'm about to grab them. But I'm frozen in time. And I say to myself, oh, I've gone into freeze. In other words, I still was connected to my prefrontal cortex, the red part of the brain, and I'm pointing to the front of my head right here, right now, because that's exactly where I was, coming back from my brainstem, way at the back of my head, to the front of my head, awareness and noticing. And then what did that do? It unfroze me. And then I was able to take a breath and then not be concerned. I was certainly concerned, but not go into the full-on worry part of the brain because there was so much I couldn't control. So our goal in all of this is to stay connected, all three parts of the brain, so that we have full-on awareness. We still want to be able to communicate our neural pathways so that they are working and moving so that the whole brain basically stays open for business, open for performance. We don't want powering down to happen. And the way that we do that is to be able to pay attention, to be able to accept and not fight it when we go into the worry part of our brain or when we go into brainstem. And then that helps us still come out and still to be able to think more clearly. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Bruce Perry, came up with this cool kind of analogy for brain regulation. So you can see my hand on the slide if you're looking, and you can see that when we are regulated, the whole part of our brain stays connected, just like your fist with the thumb tucked in. So when you make a fist, and you can show this to your athletes, this top of the brain is your prefrontal cortex, your playbook, your thinking part of the brain. When you open up, the emotional part of the brain is right in the middle, And then at the back, that's your brainstem. Our goal is to stay connected, is to be able to keep it together, so to speak. Think of the language that we have to describe freaking out or being dysregulated. What do we say? We say things like, they lost it, they flipped out, they blew their top, they blew it, they lost their head. In Scotland, where I grew up, we say lost the place or lost the plot. And so basically, we're talking about this, the flip. Our goal instead is to be able to stay connected so that we can keep it together. In our brain, in our body, and in our mind. Keep it together is the goal. In Scotland, they would say, keep the heat. And that's it. You keep the heat. You keep connected all together. So one of the ways to keep it together is to know what type of anxiety you might be feeling at a certain point in time. So there's the big five, I'm calling them. So 5 types of anxiety. So what do we have? We have generalized anxiety. That's that overall worry. That's the preparing for the worst scenario. That's the what ifing. And often we'll see athletes being worried about injury or re-injury or deselection or poor performance outcomes. Social anxiety is the fear of embarrassment, the fear of judgment, the fear of being laughed at. How many times as coaches do we worry about other people's judgment of us? And, fair game, there's a lot on the line. Your job at times too. But fear of others judging you or looking at your stats and making public mistakes where you might be embarrassed. The other thing too is keep in mind if any of your athletes, and by the way, 10% of athletes will be experiencing an anxiety disorder. 10% of people in Canada experiencing anxiety disorder, that's significant. So if any of those athletes are sitting on the bench and it's time for a penalty shot, and their social anxiety is kicking in, that might not be the best person to choose. Separation anxiety, fear of separation or injury or death of a loved one. And I've seen this even in our young adult population at national training camps where there's excessive homesickness. Panic, of course, that's what our gymnast, our 10-year-old gymnast was showing. And, those acute short-lived episodes where there's the shortness of breath, tightness in the chest, racing heart, an impending sense of something coming up. And then phobias, there's your other one in the big 5. And sometimes we'll see athletes having phobic reactions around weather. It's quite a common one. Tornadoes or lightning, and they get a really agitated response if they're outside and having to compete, and there's lightning around, and then they have to stop. The other one I noticed for myself was I had no idea about this until I had to have an MRI recently. Oh yeah, back to the bad hip story. And I went into an MRI, and I had no idea that I was a bit claustrophobic or agoraphobic. And then I started to put it together. So having that awareness for yourself is vitally important to help you then manage and then have some other strategies to deal with it. What are some things that kind of get into this mix? It's kind of like an anxiety soup, and what boils it up a little bit? Things like obsessive compulsive traits. And of course, all of us in high performance tend to have a bit of perfectionistic tendencies, high performance or high achievement tendencies, obsessive compulsive traits, superstitious thinking can ramp this up, as well as past trauma, injury trauma, or past losses can all fuel this as well. So here's a fun fact for you. Performance anxiety doesn't tend to have its own category, but is considered a combination of a bit of generalized anxiety, so a bit of that general worry, the social anxiety, the fear of judgment or fear of public embarrassment, and then panic. So here we have another poll for you, and we would love for you to be able to lean in, and we're going to start to launch the poll. And I'd just like you to think about how anxiety might show up for you. And we're going to show a poll where you are going to assess yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. And the reason I say 1 to 10 is I actually teach this with athletes. I want them to be able to say at any given point in time, when how they're feeling, and if they can say confidence, rate it 1 to 10, anxiety, rate it 1 to 10, so that then we know where we stand and what we need to do with it. So if we're able to launch the poll now, looks like it's coming. And the scale of 1 to 10, so 1 is going to be super chill. You don't really care. Here it comes. Awesome. And 10 is going to be you're losing it and it's really bothering you. How anxious are you about creating an effective and optimal training program for your athletes? Now, just so you know, polls on Zoom are completely anonymous. We cannot see at all who is responding to what. So please feel free to be open and safe to respond in any way you want. That's awesome. Yeah, we're over 50%. Oh, it's going fast. 65, 75. You guys are doing awesome. 88%. Woohoo! 83% responded so far. That's great. 85% voted. That's brilliant. That's great. So we can see we're going to launch. We have 7. Susan, high achiever, I said, oh, I'll do 3 questions. No, we have 7. So here we have, 40% of respondents, don't get too worried about putting down an effective and optimal training program. And you guys can see that right there. So about 35% is kind of moving up, ramping up a little bit, and then 18%. And then 1% in the high range too. And anxiety can be helpful, as we know, because it can motivate us. Your job is to create an effective and optimal periodized training program. And so you want to just be able to acknowledge your anxiety. If it keeps you up at night, then, there's some things you can do to manage that. So let's go on to our next question. Thank you very much. Awesome. And what about deselecting an athlete? On the scale of 1 to 10, where do you think you're at with that? Thanks for playing along. You guys are doing great. Awesome. I'm loving those numbers ticking away here. Jason's nodding. 75, 6, 78%, 79% responding. Awesome. 82%. Great. Okay, so let's look at the trend here. There's a little bit more anxiety provoking. Yeah, so 7 to 8 out of 10. So kind of around the 80%-ish mark around anxiety for deselecting an athlete. Yeah, not that easy. Lots come into play there. A bit of pressure for sure. Stress, pressure. And also it normalizes it for you too. If you're seeing that, you're like, oh, I didn't know that many of my colleagues feel that way too. Yeah, let's keep going to the next one. Thank you. How anxious are you answering these questions? What do you notice in your body? Nice. Yeah, just notice it right now and just lay it down. I like it. Oh, yes. Boom. 80%. Easy. Not a problem. All right, let's move on. Yeah, here's a COVID question. The next one coming up. Yeah, I like this. 80% of you are like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, cut 2%. You can see the range of anxiety too. And 2% become a little bit more anxious. Depends how seriously you're taking it too. Yeah, here's a COVID question. How are you doing not training in person with your athletes at your facility right now? So you'll remember 1 is super chill, don't really care, and 10 is really bothering you. 10, you're kind of losing it, it's really bothering you. And anywhere in between. Yeah, thanks for honestly answering these. Woo, 86%. Nice, we're getting fast on these. Good job. Yeah, so, yeah, we've got, ooh, what's happening? There we are. So between 5 and 6 out of 10, or 7 and 8 out of 10, and some are 3 to 4 out of 10 anxiety. But it is a bit of an anxiety provoking time. for sure. That would be normal. So a quarter of us are feeling quite anxious about that. Awesome. So that was question 5. Question 6. Here we have not knowing when or if, and I'm saying if because I'm hearing for some coaches that some of the training facilities may not be reopening. Yeah, how are you doing with this one? Awesome. We're voting quickly here. Already up at 76%, 78, 80. Yep, there we go. Boom, well done. Yeah, that's an anxiety-provoking one, isn't it? So if we look at that, 42% of us are feeling significant anxiety around not knowing when this facility will reopen. Yeah, so that really normalizes it for us, doesn't it? Is that this is an anxiety-provoking time indeed. And then last question for you. Here we go. In a high-stakes competition for all the marbles, the clock is ticking and your athletes are very nervous. What number of anxiety do you get out of 10? And this question goes really for everyone, doesn't it? It's not just coaches. It would go for athletes, obviously, but also your IST. You know, what about your support team too, if you have any? Yeah, so some of you are 3% are super chill. And then kind of the chunk, 34, 32, 13%, yeah, are starting to get anxious significantly, which would make sense, The other thing about anxiety too is that there's a contagion effect. It is contagious. The central nervous system reads other people's anxiety. And when you read anxiety, then the threat danger threshold starts to spike and go off. And it's like, oh, well, if they're anxious, then I should be anxious too. So then we get this contagion. Awesome. Thanks so much for participating in those. And then that leads Jason and I to be able to chat a little bit more about it.
Oh, that's terrific. It's so great, Susan, because I think one of the conversations that we have had around this is that it is a very uncertain time. There's a lot of different things going on, a lot of you know, how your season's going to look. Is it going to be compressed? You know, maybe you're off right now, but what's going to happen in the future? How's your enrollment going in your club? I think there's a lot of moving parts to it. So what I was kind of hoping to come from a lot of these webinars with our mental performance team is to start thinking about how we can develop some of the skills or some of the tools on our tool belt about how can we start planning now for the things that we can do once we get into the facility. You know, how can we build up some of those skills away from